Welcome everyone to our final long-term fellows talk of this calendar year. I hope and trust that everybody had a pleasant Thanksgiving and that the semester is winding up as calmly and tranquilly and stresslessly as it can. I did want to just mention a couple of things before I introduce today's speaker. As most of you know, the reading room is going to be closed tomorrow for an event that is happening from 4:30 to 7:30 p.m., which is the Presidential Faculty Award. This term given to David Kurtzer, who is a professor here at Brown and former provost, and Pulitzer Prize-winning author. So for those of you who are able to attend, I think that will be very much worth attending. The other announcement is that next Wednesday, December 9th at 4 p.m., we will be hearing from Emily Floyd, who is a fellow, currently a fellow, has been with us for several months, and is a PhD candidate in art history and Latin American studies, talking about ambiguous copies, religious prints, reproduction, and originality in the colonial Andes. So please join us next week for that. And finally, that we're saying goodbye to Tessa Murphy later on this week, and so we wish her well as she continues her sojourns. So today we have the pleasure of hearing from Danny Zborover, who is our 2015-16 National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow in residence here through May. Danny received his PhD in archaeology from the University of Calgary and came to us after having a year-long fellowship at UC San Diego. He is a broadly trained historical archaeologist who has worked on the archaeology of literate societies and the interdisciplinary integration of archaeological, historical, and ethnographic sources, as we will clearly see intermingled together in his presentation here today. He has conducted more than a decade of research in the Oaxacan Chontal highlands of southern Mexico, which is the area of his current book project. And this project explores themes of long-term colonial processes, social identities, and mobility. He has participated in a wide range of interdisciplinary projects as well in Mexico, Ecuador, Peru, the US, Canada, and Israel, leading all of us, I think, that I'm not alone, in wondering where the heck Danny Zborover really is from, and who is he really? Quién es? Mise? All of these questions in languages that he may or may not understand. In any case, we're thrilled to have Danny here as a fellow this year. He has engaged, I think, incredibly well with the community of archaeologists and anthropologists here at Brown, demonstrating, I think, a very effective kind of collaboration that we can have between the JCB and these other campus constituencies. And we look forward to hearing more about the project, Written in the Land, Cartographies of Long-Term Colonialism in Southern Mexico, and to hearing directly from Danny.
Okay, good morning everyone, or afternoon. Thank you for coming, especially in this horrible weather. Just to clarify, I'm not going to talk a lot or at all about archaeology today. So if you came to see shirts, you can leave right now. There won't be too many for you. But before I begin, I would like to, again, thank Neil and the wonderful staff at the JCB and the National Endowment for the Humanities who funded this wonderful fellowship here at this institutions. I would also like to thank my fellow fellows here. We had a lot of great stimulating conversations in the last couple of months, and some of these actually going to show up in this presentation. Although the blockbuster movie is yet to come out, we all know the story already. Conqueror meets conquered. Conquered becomes infatuated with conqueror. Conqueror holds conqueror prisoner in his own palace. Yada yada yada, noche triste. And less than 2 years after the fateful meeting, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan is in ruins. And so, in 1529, a new Spanish dawn rises over the once glorious Aztec Empire, here represented with their respective emblems. And the colonial period had begun. Cortés loses no time. He sends his trustworthy commander, Pedro de Alvarado, with 200 men and 40 horses to conquer and subdue the indigenous kingdoms along the Mar del Sur, or what we now call the Pacific Ocean. This is where the story gets a bit complicated. So to familiarize you all with the different players, I glossed the most important ones. So pay attention because this will be later on the exam. From Mexico City, the army is heading towards the Mixtec kingdom of Tututepec, or Hill of the Bird, in what is today the state of Oaxaca. Almost immediately, Alvarado executes its native ruler, Coatzintecutli, on charges of plotting a revolt and then installing his son, Ixtaquiautzin, as a puppet king. This Mixtec ruler was then baptized with the not-so-original name, Pedro de Alvarado. The original Spanish Pedro de Alvarado, though, soon continued with his troop down to the port of Huatulco, or place of the tree, and finding no resistance there from the Nahua-speaking Pochotec rulers, in April of 1522, Alvarado claimed the place in the name of the Spanish king Carlos V. While we don't have details of the event, or at least I haven't found any, we might perhaps imagine it was something similar to this depiction of Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who almost 10 years earlier reached the Pacific Ocean from Panama and took possession of it in the name of the Spanish king. Alvarado quickly realizes that this is one of the best natural harbors along the Pacific coast, and a decade later, this indeed will become the main transport and trading Pacific port for the Habsburgian Empire, connecting New Spain to central Mexico, to Central America, Peru, and even Asia for most of the 16th century, thus setting the scene for the later Manila galleon that operated through Acapulco and the Spanish control over the Philippines. In the early maps of the Americas, there aren't too many places marked yet, but it is not a coincidence that Huatulco is one of those few, such as this 1575 map in the JCB that shows the port in a rather exaggerated proportion to its actual size. There it is, the port right there, and a detail. By 1542, the port of Huatulco was chosen as the seat for the Alcaldía Mayor, and in the mid-16th century had a mixed population of indigenous, Spanish, and mestizos, as well as Filipino merchants and African slaves. The circulating wealth, however, quickly drew the attention of English, Dutch, and French pirates, who attacked the ships, the port, and the neighboring villages. Among those, the most famous were Francis Drake and Thomas Cavendish, who between 1579 and 1587 plundered the port. Cavendish is also known for his failed attempt to destroy the famous cross of Huatulco, a highly significant yet little understood object of adoration that was believed to have been placed on the Pacific shore in pre-Hispanic times by Quetzalcoatl himself. At least these are some of the oral traditions that Burgoa collected in the 17th century. Huatulco largely declined in the early 17th century after the persistent pirate attacks and the epidemics brought to the relocation of the main port to Acapulco. The pirates, however, continued to attack the port and inland towns well into the 18th century, and later buccaneers and explorers such as William Dampier provided descriptions of Huatulco and its mainland. And this is from a JCB map that I believe it's probably, if not the earliest, one of the earliest depiction of the port of Huatulco. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As Alvarado and his men continued their conquests along the Pacific coast, They also met with stern resistance in the Chontal village of Arstata, or place of the heron. The Spanish kicked the Chontal asses and ended their successful expedition along the Mar del Sur in Tehuantepec, or Hill of the Jaguar, another powerful kingdom ruled by the Zapotec lord Cosijopi II. Cosijopi receives the Spanish with open arms and soon converts and adopts the name Don Juan Cortés in honor of his new sovereign, or maybe because Alvarado was already taken by the king of Tehuantepec. On the way back to Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, Alvarado is again attacked in the town of Jalapa del Marqués by joint forces sent by Jalapa indigenous ruler and Chontal troops from the nearby town of Tequisistlan. Alvarado almost loses his life in this battle, but eventually the indigenous forces are defeated once again. In the following years, Cortés and Alvarado will pass once again through this region on their way to conquer Guatemala and beyond. And it is from here that Cortés would later build and launch the ships that explored the northern Pacific coast and all the way to California. And the rest is colonial history. But whose colonial history is it really? Let's rewind and look at this again. Soon after that fateful meeting in Tenochtitlan, Cortés and his people are housed as guests in Moctezuma's palace. Shortly after, Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a foot soldier in Cortés's army and an astute observer, narrates in his Historia Verdadera an event that they witnessed there. I remember that when great lords from other lands came before Moctezuma to discuss boundaries and villages, they brought him their dispute or business painted and drawn on cloth or sheet made of agave fiber, and with thin and very polished poles, they demonstrated the cause for the dispute. Next to Montezuma were two old men, great lords, who, when these judges well understood the reasons for the dispute, they told Montezuma their judgment, who, with very few words, ordered who would take the lands or villages. While Bernal Díaz tells of this legal deliberation almost in passing, this is a very significant passage, as it is one of the earliest description of an indigenous document type we know today as lienzo, which is the Spanish term for canvas. Their common large size, and this is, again, maybe something how Bernal Díaz actually saw that event folding. Their common large size, one-sided narrative, and the foldable medium that makes it easy to carry these around argue for their use in public rather than personal context. And I often like to think of those as kind of an indigenous PowerPoint. Okay, so something like that. We indeed have many such documents surviving from 16th century all throughout central Mexico, and they are almost always characterized by a central pictorial toponym of a ruling indigenous town, surrounded by a series of toponymic boundary markers. These toponyms are most typically represented with a stylized hill glyph, and this is an example from Oaxaca, the Lienzo de Tequixtepec, and you can see here the hill glyph, and these are the ruling elite of this place. Related to that bounded territory, there's usually a story, a pictorial narrative that explains how this geopolitical entity came to be, either in the form of a conquest of other polities, alliances with other rulers, and transference of land titles down a genealogical line. And some of these genealogies go back hundreds of years and in fact collectively represent the oldest continuous histories recorded in the Western Hemisphere. And this is just a detail from one of those lienzos, Lienzo de Zacatepec, just to show you the amount of, again, detail that are encapsulated in those documents. This is just this corner, and there, as you can see, a lot going on there. I would therefore like to offer the collective term of territorial narratives to this type of documents. While Bernal Díaz does not tell us from where this disputing delegation came from, when we count the number of lienzos known today to scholars, the state of Mexico, where Tenochtitlan was located, is almost the last in line. The vast majority, hands down, come from the state of Oaxaca, where Cortés sent Alvarado to. And when we look at another indigenous cartographic genre, that of the mapas of the Relaciones Geográficas composed by indigenous authors and added to the Spanish questionnaire around 1580, we see that Oaxaca is again leading. I'll get back to the Spanish conquest story in a minute, but right now I'd like to make a quick, though I hope relevant detour, and argue that the fact that we have so many surviving lienzos and mapa for the Oaxacan region is far from arbitrary. In 16th century Oaxaca, where most of these documents were composed, this tradition of telling a territorial narrative through a sequence of toponyms was already very old. We also see it clearly in the famous Mixtec codices composed in the 14th or 15th century, but which narrated events go back retrospectively to the 11th century and probably before. And like in the lienzo, the narratives are tied to specific places or a meandering sequence of toponyms which, again, narrate conquests, alliances, and genealogy. Without going into too many details, during the Classic period, we see the same type of toponymic-based territorial narratives carved in stone throughout Oaxaca, but not so much anywhere else. And these are quite different in format than the Maya stele, for example. And I would even dare to argue that the first territorial narrative in Oaxaca, and in fact in Mesoamerica, is to be found carved on the facade of Building J in Monte Alban, dating to the 1st century BC. In fact, the lineal sequence of toponyms is very reminding of a lienzo or a codex in stone. And while there are several conflicting interpretations of what this territory narrative might be, considering the historical trajectory I just showed you, I think we can still argue for Alfonso Caso's original interpretation that these are all places conquered by Monte Alban through time, and that the upturned heads are the respective defeated rulers. These are the defeated rulers, this is the hill sign, the squarish thing, and these are basically the toponyms, the naming of those specific towns, so Hill of the Rabbit, for example. In fact, this was the basis behind some scholars' hypothesis that around the 1st century BC, Monte Alban had ruled over an empire that extended all the way south to the Pacific coast, including the aforementioned kingdoms of Tututepec and Tehuantepec, Hill of the Bird and Hill of the Jaguar. But then again, this is a slimy can of worms that I really don't want to stick my hand into right now. Either way, I argue that we are dealing here with a long-standing documentary tradition, a historical genre, if you will, that originated from southern Mexico and later spread throughout central Mesoamerica, all through the lienzo that Bernal Diaz was describing, and as I will show later, continues to this day. Throughout history, these territorial narratives function as toponymic-based charters that structured indigenous corporate and factional identities through time, and linked actor-based agency with long-term institutional trends. As such, these are particularly suitable for exploring conceptual frameworks of territoriality within multi-ethnic literate societies, and by their very nature as geopolitical charter, provide a unique perspective into the mechanism of colonialism and factional competition among and between indigenous and European interaction spheres. And I will get to this point later on. Okay, so on with the story. Cortés holds Moctezuma hostage in his own palace, yada yada yada, noche triste, and the capital is finally conquered by Cortés and about 1,000 of his men, and as we all well know, hundreds of thousands of Tlaxcalans and other indigenous conquistadors who hated the Aztecs' guts. So when Cortés finally sits on the imperial throne, even if as proxy to the Spanish king, he starts getting visits from all those other indigenous polities that were either hostile to the Aztecs or under their colonial yoke, which was often the same thing. And this is where it gets interesting. In a short paragraph in his third Carta de Relación, Cortés tells Carlos V of such a delegation visiting on behalf of Cosijopi II, the same Zapotec ruler of Tehuantepec, who Alvarado would later meet on the coast in person, and those that the delegation offered their servitude to the new king as they exchanged gift, which, as Cortés reports, made them very happy, y se volvieron muy alegres. Tehuantepec, if you remember, is a long ways from Tenochtitlan, but perhaps it is not too surprising that this kingdom will come all the way to celebrate together with the Spanish, since they themselves were fighting with the Aztecs just a few years before. And while in their codices the Aztecs claimed to have conquered and exacted tribute from Tehuantepec, here you see it, Hill of the Jaguar, and this is from the Matricula de Tributos, some of the tribute. Cosijopi II merely considered himself as periodically exchanging gifts with them. Here, as in many other cases in Mesoamerica and New Spain, imperialism and colonialism were often a matter of perspective. But why did the Zapotec delegation return so happy after the meeting is only revealed later in the letter, when Cortés explained to the Spanish king that the reason that he sent Alvarado to the Pacific coast, and particularly to Tehuantepec, was because the Mixtec ruler there was hostile to the Zapotec king of Tehuantepec, who in turn was a loyal subject to the Spanish and allowed them to discover the South Sea through his kingdom. Cortés also laconically mentioned that in addition to the 200 Spanish soldiers, Alvarado was also accompanied by a lot of good warriors. Llevaba mucha y buena gente de guerra. Most likely a combined army of thousands of Tlaxcalans, Nahuas, and Zapotecs. So in addition to explaining why Alvarado was so quick to blame and execute Coatzintecutli, the ruler of Tehuantepec, this version of history further casts the Spanish as pawns in a long and complex territorial conflicts along the Pacific coast, and their conquest as deeply embedded in cycles of indigenous politics and colonialism that was still going strong in the 16th century. Now, this story, according to the retrospective narratives of the Mixtec codices, started way before, in the 11th century AD, with an intrusive colony of Mixtecs from the highland who established themselves in Tehuantepec, Hill of the Bird, right here, from where their lord Adir, this guy, launched a military campaign that resulted in the conquest of over 50 communities and political alliances with a dozen others. Here you can see him conferring with one of these rulers, and these are some of the places he conquered. You can see the spear. It's kind of sticking into the hill glyph, and you can see smoke. They're burning, basically. In one of the pages of the Mixtec Codex novel, we see Lord Adir, after a long campaign, as he literally conquers the Pacific Ocean. Here you can see the spear, this Adir, and the spear into the Pacific Ocean. 4 centuries before Alvarado and Vasco Nunez did it. And I have to show this weird juxtaposition of the image, the JCB image of Vasco Nunez and Adir, and it's really, I don't know, very similar, especially how they hold their weapons and their shield. I don't know what's that about, but it's very curious. This nascent Mixtec empire was probably even more powerful in the first 2 decades of the 16th century, and among the few and largest polities that were able to remain independent from the Aztec Empire. Among these subject communities, we see several indigenous rulers presenting gifts or tribute to Lord Adir. Some of these are coastal products like cacao and feathers, and some gold objects. So these are the people who present their tribute. In the Relaciones Geográficas of 1579, the Pochotec rulers of the port of Huatulco, where Alvarado continues next, tell the Spanish official that they indeed used to be ruled over and pay tribute in gold to, and other goods to Tehuantepec. So by getting rid of Coatzintecutli and placing his son as a puppet, the Spanish were doing a favor not just to the Zapotec ruler of Tehuantepec, but also to their Pochotec subject of Huatulco. This might explain why Alvarado is received with open arms when he next passes through this port in April of 1522. And while I still cannot firmly identify Huatulco in the codices if it's there, elsewhere I propose other correlation to nearby towns and non-archaeological sites, such as Cacaluta or Place of the Crow. And my colleague John Paul and I have a field program running in this area for a couple of years now, and we're going to go back this summer with a group of students and look for more sites. It is likely, though, that the Mixtecs annexed Huatulco to their kingdom early on, considering that this is one of the best naturally protected harbors along the Mexican Pacific coast. With this, we also suspect that in the process they were aiming to gain control over the Pacific maritime trade network of the post-classic period. It is probably not a coincidence that in 15th century Mesoamerica, the Mixtec artists were renowned for two things: amazing turquoise artwork and gold cast figures. We know that the turquoise raw material came all the way from the American Southwest, while the gold working technique, at least, likely traveled north from Central and South America. Seen in this light, the choice of the port as the main Spanish hub for long-distance trade with the north and south was also not just a matter of geography, but is most likely building on the existing Mixtec, Pochutec, and Zapotec networks along the coast. In the context of the turquoise and abalone shell trade, which at this point were already rolling for several hundreds of years, we also have to wonder if Cortez's discovery, quote unquote, of California was not just him simply being taken for a ride, literally. But that's all still very speculative. All right, so leaving Huatulco, Alvarado's purpose was probably to reunite with his newfound Zapotec friend in Tehuantepec, who in fact was the one who started this whole thing. Before he's able to do so, though, I mentioned that he was having some difficulties with the Chontal people who attacked him in Astata, place of the heron. Why this happened might be better explained if we consider, again, the indigenous colonial geopolitics along the coast. Like Tututepec, the kingdom of Tehuantepec was also an intrusive polity to the Pacific coast, and according to the codices and 16th century lienzos, was a factional Zapotec family that migrated from the valley of Oaxaca in the mid-15th century, led by Cosijopi I, the grandfather of Cosijopi II, who later became Don Juan Cortez. It's a bit confusing, actually confused a lot of the local history. Cosijopi I is not the father, he is in fact the grandfather of Cosijopi II. As Judith Zeiten and Michel Auday convincingly demonstrated through documentary and archaeological research, this too was a large takeover enterprise that encompassed most of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and the eastern Pacific coast. And numerous indigenous groups who became subject paid a heavy tribute to the Zapotecs. Here you can actually see them seated, some of those subject communities paying tribute to the king of Tehuantepec, and here is the Hill of the Tiger again. But this also implied that now we have two hegemonic powers vying over the coveted Pacific coast, and as we already know, they didn't get along. We also know from the Relaciones Geográficas that the Pochutec of Huatulco were helping Tututepec to fight Tehuantepec, which is maybe why they were gaining more ground. It is interesting, though, that they clash right around the Chontal region, leaving this ethnic group in a sort of a political buffer zone, not being allied with neither the Spanish-friendly Zapotecs or the subdued Mixtecs and Pochutecs might explain why when meeting Alvarado and his troops, the Chontal chose fighting over diplomacy. In fact, I suspect that this is exactly what happened when Alvarado left Tehuantepec back to Mexico City and was attacked again by a Chontal army from Tequisistlan, only this time joining forces with the Jalapa del Marqués Cacique, who himself was having territorial disputes with Cosijopi II. At this point, however, Alvarado's ever-growing army of indigenous conquistadors was also bolstered by heavy force of Zapotec soldiers from Tehuantepec, and the battle was won in favor of the Spanish. But the plot thickens. A few years ago, I had the rare opportunity to see this lienzo, which is still kept in a Highland Chontal village, and where the narrative focuses on the conquest and polity-making of the Chontal Boer King III Hummingbird. But what is even more interesting is that these conquests are cast in the context of a factional competition between those communities that were allied with III Hummingbird and those who allied with the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma. In the corner of the document, the scribe even added the familiar eagle on the cactus, the emblem of Tenochtitlan. This is a fascinating document where at least 3 different hands later added glosses onto the pictorial narrative in Chontal, Nahuatl, and Spanish. You can see some of these here. The Aztec intrusion is also referenced in 3 other documents from the region, including another territorial narrative that we just found about 2 years ago in another Chontal village, where I'm currently working with my colleague Aaron Sonnenschein here on a new project that looks at this particular community, San Miguel Ecatepec, mobility, settlement mobility through time, from the late post-classic to the late colonial period. And I presented this at the Zhukovsky Institute a few weeks ago, but if anyone is interested, we can talk about this later on. This imperial presence in the region, in fact, makes a lot of sense if you consider that both Tehuantepec and Tuxtepec were antagonistic to the Aztecs. Therefore, it is likely that the Aztecs were taking advantage of this buffer zone and the loose political affiliation of the Chontal as a way to gain access to the Oaxacan Pacific coast, and perhaps more specifically to the Chontal Highlands and coast, access to gold ores and the coveted cochineal and purpura shell dyes. In fact, the Pochotec of Huatulco, when they tell the Spanish official about the tribute that they paid to Tuxtepec, they say they paid in gold dust that they got from the Highland Chontal. So we know that this is probably the region where the gold dust or the gold is coming from. At this point, I hope I demonstrated that we really cannot understand the course and outcomes of the Spanish conquest on the coast without understanding what came before. But this is only half of the story. And what follows equally shows that these same indigenous colonial agents kept playing a double game under the Spanish colonial enterprise, and where territorial narratives continue to serve a significant role in the formation and demarcation of this newly political landscape. In the late 1520s, both Tuxtepec and Tehuantepec saw their once expansive empires significantly reduced. As Mary Elizabeth Smith has shown, in 1541, the Mixtec Pedro de Alvarado, previously known as Ixtacquiautzin, modified the pre-Hispanic Codex Colombino by erasing some places and adding glosses, so to argue for the boundaries of this Cacicazgo based on those places conquered by Lord Adir in the 12th century. His descendants did the same in another territorial dispute as late as 1717. Again, this is Tuxtepec, Hill of the Bird again, and you can see how some of these elements were deliberately erased and glosses were added throughout. This was done in 1541. In fact, we see Tuxtepec still featuring prominently in the 1707 map, at around the same time that they were having the other dispute in Tuxtepec, as well as in others from the JCB collection, both as a town and as a territory, right here. The port of Huatulco is also emphasized, although at this point the Spanish mostly abandoned it in favor of Acapulco. As for Tehuantepec, in the Relaciones Geográficas mapas from this region and in the lienzo from the subject town of Huilotepec, we see that the western boundary of the Zapotec kingdom was demarcated just to the east of the Chontal region, thus effectively losing control over the stretch of the Pacific coast. I'm sure you probably can't see it, but this is the Hill of the Tiger right here, and here it is again. But what is most interesting is that in this indigenous political vacuum, a new territorial charter was drafted around the mid-16th century to fill in the gap between these now reduced hegemonic territories. This is the Lienzo de Texistán y Tecuatepec, which showed this either factual or proposed indigenous polity, and if my reconstruction of the Lienzo is correct, then this territorial narrative was drafted in no other place than the port of Huatulco. And I would like to point the large tree, which is the toponym for Huatulco, and again, the ocean on the bottom. What is remarkable about this document is that it brings all that convoluted colonial history together, or at least as this was conceived and tailored in the early Spanish colonial period. The Pochotec cacique, who most likely commissioned this document, is seated in front of the palace at the center of his kingdom, while positioning himself at the intersection of several narrative lines. Behind him is his genealogical bloodline, 7 generations back. A framed scene outside the kingdom boundary showed the migration of a distant progenitor, perhaps arriving from the Valley of Mexico. Another narrative lines follow four Chontal nobles who are conquering the highlands and capturing Zapotec prisoners with the aid of an Aztec warrior. These lords are then given land and towns to rule, but in turn, we see them paying tribute to the Pochote Cacique. To legitimize these territorial and tributary rights, the cacique also made sure to include the previous rulers of this land, Coatzintecutli and Ixtaquiautzin of Tututepec. This is Coatzintecutli and Ixtaquiautzin, and we know because of the headdress is actually their name. They're wearing their name on their head, literally. Outside the boundaries of this kingdom is the ruler of Tehuantepec, effectively excluded. As you might able to see, or maybe not, in this image, this toponym was later erased and replaced with another one representing the place of the heron, or Astata. Above it, it is here somewhere, and above it, right here, is the town of Tequisistlan. These are exactly the two Chontal communities that attacked Alvarado, suggesting that their autonomous status from indigenous political affairs had continued well into the 16th century. What is more remarkable, though, is what the lienzo is omitting. Carlos V, Cortés, Alvarado, or even Gutierrez de Humada, the Spanish encomendero of Huatulco, are completely missing. There are no Spanish and Filipino merchants, African slaves, or pirates. And this is not a fluke, as we see it in all the lienzos that I mentioned here, and in fact in many others from Oaxaca. I believe that this is because this type of territorial narrative was still aimed primarily at indigenous audiences rather than European ones, even as late as the 18th century. This is a longue-durée history of Pacific Coast colonialism, with present colonizers excluded. That is, of course, not to say that the indigenous people were oblivious to their present situation, okay? And the only non-indigenous element in the lienzo are very telling in this regard. One of a cross that, right here, that in fact might allude to the famous cross of Huatulco, and the other one is a Spanish-style hat that the cacique is wearing, although he's otherwise indigenous attire. By displaying these powerful symbols of religious and political authority, the cacique is truly mastering what Yana Yanakakis called the art of being in between, as he further pledges his new Chontal subject to be their faithful representative in front of the new colonial regime. Before I wrap up, I would like to take another quick detour, but this time to the present. With 16 ethno-linguistic groups and over 200 dialects, Oaxaca of today is the most ethnically and linguistically diverse state, and with the largest indigenous population in Mexico. And as I've shown here, many of these communities are still guarding these colonial period lienzos and mapas, even if the indigenous caciques who originally commissioned them are long gone. What we also see is that these documents, especially those that kept circulating in indigenous interaction spheres, were not just snapshots of historical events or processes, but they are living documents that were constantly modified and customized through time to accommodate to new realities and create colonial palimpsests. And where the lienzos are gone, many of the other communities are still using 18th century alphabetic primordial titles, or títulos primordiales, or 19th to 20th century cadastral maps, both of which are transformations of early territorial narrative. If not in content, then surely in form. These are some examples from the Chontal Highlands. And in one Chontal community, we even came across a local chronicler, Florencio Aparicio Hernandez, who up until his passing a few years ago was still drawing those distinctive sequences of named mountains on pieces of paper, and uses those as mnemonic devices to recount his village territorial narratives. And of course, these narratives are also encoded in the Chontal landscape in the form of toponymic-based oral traditions, many of which still echo the conquests and exploits of Three Hummingbird, Moctezuma, the Pochotec ruler of Huatulco, and the Zapotec king of Tehuantepec. What is common to all of those, and perhaps to all the territorial narratives since Monte Alban, is that these are being used as charters to define, declare, and defend a communal territory against hostile incursions, be it indigenous, European, or currently the Mexican government and Canadian mining companies. And again, I don't want to go, you can insert your own neocolonialism commentary right there. It might just be that the longevity of the territorial narrative genre in Oaxaca and the fact that both indigenous and Spanish court of law accepted these as bona fide legal documents can further explain why over 70% of Oaxaca's territorial expanse is still under communal ownership, more than any other Mexican state. In the Chontal Highland, we recorded several cases where these documents are periodically brought up from the municipal archives to resolve territorial disputes between neighboring indigenous communities, exactly as described by Bernal Diaz in Moctezuma's palace. These, of course, never do actually get resolved. But if there is indeed a correlation between the number of lienzos and mapas and inter-community territorial conflicts, then here again it is not surprising that there are more such agrarian disputes in Oaxaca than in any other state. And this is in fact a very serious social problem for Oaxaca, where dozens of people get killed every year. And if, just if, an autochthonous documentary tradition is behind this territorial factionalism, could that also explain why Oaxaca has 570 municipalities? Again, way, way more than any other state. These are some of the questions I will keep thinking about here at the JCB. So ask me again in a few months, unless you already know the answer and you can save me a lot of time by telling me right now. Okay, to conclude, 2 more paragraphs. I believe that the reason we fail to recognize these long-term stories that the Oaxacan territorial narratives tell us about indigenous colonialism is due in part to restricting disciplinary divisions. Archaeologists and epigraphers read inscriptions carved on stones and ceramics, and mostly written before the 16th century. Historians read manuscripts written on paper, but rarely those written on indigenous amate paper or hide. Almost nobody reads documents written on cloth. At the same time, the narrative I presented here is not meant to diminishing the suffering that was brought about by the Spanish conquest and colonization. This was certainly larger in scale and had a greater impact than anyone had ever experienced before, both in Mesoamerica and in Europe. It does, however, gives more agency and indeed autochthonous history to those indigenous people, a history that doesn't need the Spanish conquest as a watershed moment that determined what came before and what came after. Today, I therefore invite us all to think beyond the conceptual and temporal dichotomies of the colonial enterprise in southern Oaxaca, by populating our meta-narratives with the people, documents, and ultimately the histories that were written in this land. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Danny. We have time for questions and comments or answers to Danny's questions.
Please, I need
Floor is
answers.
open.
Well, thank you so much. This is a really fascinating discussion that you are opening up for us. I'm really happy that we got to hear this talk today. And I would like to, well, there are many things that incite in me your talk, but one of the things that I could extend to many other regions and probably even other fields in Latin American history is this presence of the past, of the ancient past, in the present, right? In the colonial present and today. And I was especially interested in your idea of the maps circulating throughout time and reframing memory, local memory, and having real implications, not just for culture up there somewhere, but real implications. So my question is about the archives, right? These maps that you showed in the pictures have been carefully kept, guarded, repainted, and redeployed, right? So 2 things there. Do you have any sense of how these archives have been actually passed down, or and what political uses these archives have had in the past? And two, when they use these maps in the courts, say today, for land disputes, what's the use that they make of that? Or how, well, on the part of the indigenous claimants, but also what's the response of the legal authorities to them? So it's like two little questions.
Well, in terms of the political uses of the archives, I don't have much information to give you. Basically, because we're just going into those archives right now, and let me show you an image of why we have a bit of, I don't know if I have it here. Well, those archives, those community archives, are first very hard to access on the one hand. I don't have it there. I thought I did, maybe. But on the other, they first we need to document them again, understand what the corpus contains. For example, in Zapotitlán, one of the communities, we just were able to help. I wish I had this image somewhere because I think it will give you an idea of what the archive looks like. No, I don't. It is, they're in a very bad state of preservation. So in one of the communities, we actually were able to work with ADABI, which is a Mexican institution that helps to organize those archives. So this is, in fact, the first archive that we can actually go into and understand what's in there. The first document we found there was from 1706. So it's not a very early archive. But as for the other ones, who knows? Again, with that new project we have with Aaron, we also have a historian on the team, Xochitl Flores, who will actually go to those communities and see what those archives are. Okay? So I don't have much information, unfortunately, at the moment. As for the use of those maps, again, it varies, but it's those usually surface when there are land disputes. So sometimes you won't even know, in many cases, you won't even know that they actually have those maps, then they actually have a conflict with the neighboring community, and then whoop, you actually have a map or a lienzo that shows our boundaries in such a moment in time, and therefore we can argue that this land is ours and not theirs, something like that. But as I also showed, these are, again, a lot of communities will have those documents, right? And these boundaries change through time, right? So there will always be conflicting territories right there, right? What the Mexican government tried to do with those things is to have a program of resolución presidencial, which are supposedly accepted maps by all. They send engineers that show where the boundaries of the communities are. But these are not accepted by the communities. These are not accepted by the communities. And again, they compare and contrast these with their own documents. So, again, there are a lot to say about this here, but...
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was really fascinating and thorough and very illuminating on many levels. I'm interested in the place of the títulos primordiales in your narrative in comparison to the older sources, to the lienzos. Because if I am not mistaken, one of the main characteristics of the títulos is, although there are 18th century and 19th century documents, to show a pedigree that goes back to the 16th century. They need to look old. They need to look as if they're actually showing that initial point of conflict between communities. And also another element is that they, as you mentioned, for the lienzos, not necessarily include the Spanish the imprint on the land. In fact, one of the main elements of the títulos is that they show most commonly a religious, mostly Christian, right? Beginning of the town with a saint or a virgin giving the land to the community, and then the Spanish conquest begins. So I think this is a very interesting connection to what you're suggesting. That this is not the Spanish presence is not the main element to point what happens there with the land, but this idea of showing us that something looks as if it was there from the very beginning. How do you see it in using, well, basically all the different kinds of sources that you're showing?
You're completely right. I mean, this one of the reasons that people consider Títulos Primordiales as a transformation of earlier documents is that they have this element of the origins, right? They always kind of start in the beginning, blah, blah, blah. And again, this is something which is very common to those Mesoamerican narratives in general, but specifically to Oaxacan territorial narratives, is that they're always retrospective. They always look back. I mean, the problem, for example, that people look at those lienzos and codices is they try to understand them supposedly when they were written, for example, or when they were the events that they're depicting. For example, the codices talk about Lord Adir conquering places in the 11th and 12th century, but they're painted in the 14th century, maybe even as late as the 15th century. So they always look back, they look at the trajectory. And for Oaxaca, at least, for some of the groups, it has to do with showing that they have real connections to the land, that they actually came from this specific land. In many other cases, for example, for the Aztecs, it's a long trajectory of migration, things like that. But you're right, and it's very interesting that they always project, retrospect back hundreds of years. And again, these are the longest history we have for the Western Hemisphere.
Andrew, and then Benjamin.
Thank you for that. I was wondering how far you'd single out that particular region of Mexico as a zone where there's indigenous muscling. I mean, I was very struck when I read Pedro Carrasco's book about the Tenochca Triple Alliance, that there's one massive power he talks about a lot in the book, which isn't in the alliance at all, which was the Tepanec Empire. And what you can see if you follow his narrative, which comes from tribute lists, is that this is still being played out in central Mexico, that there's the muscling between people from Texcoco and Azcapotzalco. And it's very clear that they're thinking in terms of territorial boundaries, where the Aztecs are considered parvenus and usurpers. I can see that in the Oaxaca region, it's linguistically and ethnically much more complex, but would you say that the kind of analysis you've done would apply to several other regions of what's now Mexico?
Definitely. In fact, I think it's the same tradition that is coming from Oaxaca as what is adopted later in central Mexico. I think it's the same tradition, but again, we see it, at least in the archaeological record, later on. And the Aztecs also use territorial narratives, but again, at least what we have remaining in stones, because we don't have pre-Hispanic codices from central Mexico for the Aztecs. These are later than in the Oaxaca region. Definitely in the 16th century, it really kind of a broader area that encompasses Mexico as well. Veracruz as well, Michoacan, we also have these type of territorial narratives, but again, not at the intensity that we see them in Oaxaca still in the 16th century. So a lot of these things, especially in the post-Catholic period where there's a lot of movement, do move around, shift around, and some of these traditions are adopted by other groups.
Rachel, last question?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of ask, and I'll ask another question later, but kind of ask, are you kind of telling us that there are multiple conquests, or are you also telling us that there are multiple chronologies? So I guess I'm, you know, like kind of, I guess I'm kind of like I want to hear a couple of sentences about how the whole empire and hemispheric story should be kind of revised if we take this Oaxaca sort of thing
Yeah.
seriously? Yeah.
Well, I basically say that we think of colonialism as, again, Spanish colonialism. That's moment in time. Sometimes it's 1519, sometimes 1521, pick your poison. But that really determines how we think of Mesoamerica. But I think we really need, or New Spain for that matter, or this region of the world, whatever you want to call it. But we need to think of it as cycles. Cycles of conquest, colonialism, sometimes imperialism, that come and go. Again, it might be starting 2,000 years ago in Oaxaca with Monte Alban. I personally doubt that. But definitely for the Pacific Coast, it started in the 11th century with Adia. So again, I think we need kind of to break that boundary that really makes us think of that region of the world of before colonialism and after colonialism. That's basically my thesis.
Yeah, sorry. No, I was just gonna. I was
Very
just gonna-
eager, I see.
Was it? Yeah, exactly. Like let's go eat already. I could hear your stomach rumbling. No, but I was just going to say that one of the things that is interesting is to what extent the nation state and the articulation of a Mexican history affects how these different regional histories, the important valence of the regional histories. I know in the case of Brazil, if you look at the history from the perspective of the Amazon River region, which today is part of Brazil, or at least part of it is, it's a completely different national narrative if you actually looked at it from that perspective. So I think that it's really, it's a fascinating foray into both, as Alcida said, the different kinds of chronologies and the different conquest histories that can be sort of spun out in a lot of different ways from different perspectives. So thanks so much for the talk and joining me. Thank you.